Our grade school playground was very nice and isolated. The school itself was surrounded by around 7 or 8 acres of forest. It meant that the supervisors had to be extra vigilant to make sure no kids wandered off when they weren't supposed to. Me and my 2 other friends were known for giving the supervisors fits because we loved to go right to the edge, right up against the tree line. I can remember they were always yelling at us. We never did actually go into the woods though. But I guess the average adult, whose job depended on keeping us out, it looked like they were going into the woods as soon as somebody turned their heads. Maybe it was the 3 of us that were the sole reason the school decided a chain link fence 40 feet in front of the tree line, all around the edges of the playground. It was a good thing they did, because soon after construction, a number of supervisors seemed to retire. The fence was actually the only thing corralling us. There were still 1 or 2 supervisors, but they couldn't possibly keep tabs on us all at once. Quick note, it might sound weird me referring to teachers and aides as supervisors, but it's what I call them. It made us feel more relaxed about playing at the edge of the forest, because now, there's a fence to make sure we could not go further. We hoped that meant the adults would leave us alone, which it did. One recess, like any other, we were the only 3 in the back 40 of the playground. We were just being ourselves when a very strange, very unpleasant feeling came over us. I looked at my other friends, and their expressions announced that they were feeling the same thing. I wondered if it was something my parents had mentioned. I didn't understand how it worked. Food poisoning. But apparently, there's a chance that anything you ate could make you sick. And somehow, I knew that the strange shape on the other side of the fence was what was making all 3 of us feel funny. What I saw, it looked like a deer trying to be a person. It had shaggy skin that still had fur attached to it. It looked like it had been taken from a roadkill. This thing was standing on its hind legs and gently tapping the hooves of its forelegs together. A soft but hypnotic-like beat. I can vividly remember my instincts telling me to run, and I shouted to my other friends to do the same, only realizing seconds later that my shout was just a mere whisper. I looked behind me to see that one of my other friends must have heard me and taken advice. The other was still standing there, staring at this thing. I tried to yell back to him to follow us, but again, I had trouble raising my voice. We had gotten back to the school where most of the kids played in the basketball court, and even though we had just eaten and had full stomachs, both of us felt very hungry and tired all of a sudden, as if the entire energy had been sucked out of us. It's like we had just spent a whole 15-16 hours awake, instantly. The notion actually occurred to me to go inside and ask if we could have a second lunch. I was going to voice my idea. When it was time to line up, we let one of the supervisors know that our friend was still at the edge of the playground. That was the first time I'd ever seen one of the supervisors flee. They ran down there quickly, and they didn't come back for a while. It turned out that our friend had gone missing, which I didn't understand how that could happen. There were no holes or openings in the fence, but it certainly made a huge issue with all the teachers. But he was gone, and no matter how the school searched, nothing was happening. He would never turn up after that. We have no idea what happened to him. It was pretty traumatic for all of us. Much of us were close to him, and we have nothing that we could even tell anybody, because nobody would believe us. We did talk to the cops since we were his closest friends, but they merely took our statements as a joke and told us to stop fooling around. I believe they even did a full search of the forest around. They found nothing. We went on, well, life moved on. Junior high, high school, college, we just learned to live with a tragedy like that. Looking back at things and how the Earth is, and how supposed reptilians exist, and other cryptids, I wouldn't be surprised if he was taken. My brother and some of his buddies were out hunting one time when they saw something they swear wasn't right. They claimed it was supernatural or something. They'd been hunting deer and had found some exciting tracks that they wanted to follow, although they couldn't quite make out what the footprints were. There were 3 of them, all fairly experienced hunters in their own right. As they followed these tracks, they noticed that these were not only animal tracks, but bipedal humanoid tracks. Thinking that they were hot on Bigfoot's trail, that's when they started to smell a really funky smell. And they were used to finding remains of animals out in the woods, victims of other hunters who hadn't cleared up their mess. But this smell they described to me was far worse. It was like death and rot, and all the worst things in the world that could have gone off at once. The one described it as garbage, like sitting out in the hot sun. One of his friends suggested they head back. No animal was worth this. They all kind of assumed at this point this was for sure Bigfoot. But my brother insisted that he wanted to kill himself a Bigfoot. He said he felt drawn to it, like it was pulling him. They heard some rustling ahead as the stench intensified. They drew back into the cover of some bushes as to not be seen and spooked. Then they saw this thing in person. The first thing he said they noticed was that this thing stood up tall, extremely tall. It did indeed have feet similar to a deer, with little cloven hooves at the end of its arms, where hands should have been, which would explain the tracks they were following. Even though this thing seemed to shapeshift almost, what they thought they were following was a Bigfoot, was indeed something else entirely. This wasn't a buck, nor was it a Bigfoot. It looked like some sort of weird mutation between the two. Its body, while looking humanoid, had a very different head and face. It almost seemed to even have small little spikes, kind of like antlers. All of them completely frozen, not exactly sure what they were seeing. My brother shot a bullet, and they all took off running, as it charged them like a barreling grizzly bear. They still have no idea what exactly it was and what they saw. My brother's only real regret was running away, and not staying to kill this thing and see it through. One day, I was staying over with some friends who lived near a huge lake, surrounded by timber. We spent most of the time in the lodge, because it was super cold, and there had even been some snow. Of course, everybody was fine, but guess who had brought the dog with them? So, even in the snow, I had to take the dog out as he needed the exercise. I didn't want him leaving any presents for my buddies. He's a big dog, and can run, and didn't seem to mind the snow at all. One of the mornings it was pretty frosty, and I was desperately hoping that he'd do what he needed to, chase his tail for a bit, and we could finally head back for coffee. But no, he chased off and ran off into the trees. I had to run after him. It was odd though. He usually never took off like this, and was not disobedient. So of course I had to run off after him, even into the woods. I had saw him, but a smell had nearly knocked me backwards. I'm telling you, the smell was the worst thing that I've ever smelt. It was awful. It kind of smelt like a rotting carcass. But this was somehow worse. It was like that stank, but much more pungent. I literally had to cover my nose and mouth with my hand. It was like I was walking through a field of rotting deer or animals, but I couldn't see anything around me, as far as cadavers go. I kept calling for my dog. I heard him, whimpering and whining. I've only ever heard him make that noise before, when he was staying at my folks and a coyote got into the yard. What the hell was in there, but smelled like death and warmed up and was scaring the hell out of my dog. At first, when I saw the thing in there, I thought I must be hallucinating. Something to potentially do with the cold and me maybe being hungry. This creature stood looming over my dog, who by this point was cowering. I was looking at some unknown animal, some sort of sick monster. Its body was tall and skeletal. It even appeared to have bits of flesh hanging from it. It was large, and its legs bent back and hunched over. The head looked like a mix of skull and wolf and even deer. It even appeared to have horns on its head, just like a buck would. In fact, it easily looked like it could have been a 4 or 5 pointer. But the smell and rot was so bad, I actually kind of vomited in my mouth and my eyes began watering. Then, all of a sudden in that moment, my cell phone started to ring. The silence was broken, and this thing looked up at me with the most evil, intense expression I've ever seen. My dog immediately took off running as fast as it could, back towards my direction, out the other end of the woods. This thing very slowly began lumbering towards me. It was like it was on stilts and had a very hard time moving in general. I took this as an opportunity to run as fast as I could. Luckily, somehow, my dog was not only far ahead of me, but heading back towards the house. I happily chased after him and made my way back into the house after about a 5-minute sprint through the snow. I never once turned around during that pursuit to see if this thing was anywhere close to me, and I never take my dog out in that side of the area ever again. In fact, after that, even though I've gone back to visit, I will never take my dog back, and I personally will never go back to that area of the woods.